Daf Yomi, Tractate Zevachim, page 89b, top of the page. We just finished the Mishnah, and now we are starting the Talmud, the Gemara. Mena Hani Mili, Nitana Rabbanan Upar Sheni Ben Bakar Tikat Lechatat. The Mishnah teaches that the placement of the blood of a sin offering precedes the sprinkling of the blood of a burnt offering, whereas the burning of the limbs of a burnt offering precedes the burning of the portions of a sin offering. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? The Gemara answers, this is as the sages taught in a Braita, discussing a verse about the consecration of the Levites. Let them take a young bull and its meal offering, fine flour mingled with oil, and a second young bull you shall take for a sin offering. Numbers 8:8. Im ba'lelamed shehen shnayim, harei kvar nemar ba'aseh echad chatas v'esachad oila. Ma tamid lo imar upar sheni ben bakar tigat lechatas. שיכול שיהיה חדש קודם לכל מעשה אוילה תמר לא ימר ופר שני בן בקר תיקח חדש. The Braita explains in this verse, if this verse comes to teach that there are two bulls, this is superfluous, as it is already stated, and offer the one for a sin offering and the other for burnt offering, Numbers 8:12. Why must the verse state, and a second young bull you shall take for a sin offering? As one might have thought that the sin offering should precede all the rites of the burnt offering. Therefore the verse states, and a second young bull you shall take for a sin offering, which indicates that the sin offering actually comes second to the burnt offering. If the Braita continues, if the verse had stated only that the sin offering is the second bull, one might have thought that the burnt offering precedes the sin offering with regards to all its rites. Therefore, the verse states, and offer the one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering, indicating that the sin offering precedes the burnt offering. How can these verses be reconciled? The placement of the blood of the sin offering precedes the sprinkling of the blood of the burnt offering, because it affects acceptance, whereas the burnt offering does not affect atonement. And burning the limbs of the burnt offering on the altar precedes burning the portions of the sin offering, in fulfillment of the phrase, and a second young bull you shall take for a sin offering. Ve'amai matanakai mesad tikdom. The Gemara asks, but why do all four placements of the blood of the sin offering precede the sprinkling of the blood of the burnt offering? Let only the first placement of blood, which affects atonement, take precedence, and those other placements should not come before the sprinkling of the blood of the burnt offering. Ravina said in the verse here, we are dealing with the sin offering brought by the Levites for their consecration, and even though it does not affect atonement and is therefore comparable to a burnt offering, the Merciful One states that the sin offering precedes the burnt offering with regard to the presentation of the blood. This indicates that, in general, all four placements of the blood of the sin offering precede the sprinkling of the blood of the burnt offering, despite the fact that only the first placement affects atonement. In the West, Eretz Israel, they say there is another answer. Once the priest commenced with the placements of the blood of the sin offering, he completes all of them before sprinkling the blood of the burnt offering. A dilemma was raised before the sages. If there is blood of a sin offering and limbs of a burnt offering to be sacrificed, which of them precedes the other? Does the blood of the sin offering take precedence due to the fact that it affects acceptance, or perhaps the limbs of the burnt offering take precedence due to the fact that they are entirely burned in the flames of the altar? Tashima. Dam chatas kodim dam oila, dam oila hu dikadim, levare oila lo kadim. The Gemara suggests, coming here, as the Mishnah teaches that the blood of a sin offering precedes the blood of a burnt offering. One can infer from this that the blood of a sin offering does not precede all elements of the burnt offering. It is only with regard to the blood of the burnt offering that it takes precedence, whereas it does not take precedence with regard to the limbs of the burnt offering. Aderabba miseifa evore oile koidmi limorichatos limorichatos hu dikodim ledam chatos lo kadim ela meha leka lemishma mina. The Gemara rejects this proof. On the contrary, the opposite conclusion can be inferred from the latter clause of the Mishnah, which teaches that limbs of a burnt offering precede the portions of the sin offering consumed on the altar. This indicates that it is only with regard to the portions of the sin offering consumed on the altar that the limbs of the burnt offering take precedence, but they do not take precedence with regard to the blood of the sin offering. The Gemara concludes, rather, no inference is to be learned from this Mishnah concerning this matter. Dam oila v'morichatos ezvehen koidim dam oila koidim dikasi mikoach klil odil ma'im morichatos koidmin dikasi, or in brackets it says dikasu mikoach michapeher. A dilemma was raised before the sages. If there is blood of a burnt offering to be sprinkled and portions of a sin offering to be burned, which of them precedes the other? Does the blood of the burnt offering take precedence as it comes from an offering that is burned in its entirety on the altar, or perhaps the portions of the sin offering to be burned to take precedence because they come from an offering that affects atonement? Tashima dam chatas koidim v'dam oila. Dam chatas hu dikodim v'dam oila aval imor chatas lo. The sages suggest, the Gemara suggests coming here, as the Mishnah teaches that the blood of the sin offering precedes the blood of the burnt offering. One can infer from this that it is only the blood of the sin offering that precedes the blood of the burnt offering, but the portions of the sin offering to be burned do not take precedence. The Gemara rejects this proof. On the contrary, the opposite conclusion can be inferred from the latter clause of the Mishnah, which teaches that the limbs of the burnt offering precede the portions of the sin offering to be consumed on the altar. This indicates that it is only the limbs of the burnt offering that precede the portions of the sin offering to be burned, but the blood of the burnt offering does not. The Gemara again concludes, rather, no inference is to be learned from this Mishnah concerning this dilemma. Dam ola v'dam Hashem mehen kodim, dam oila kodim negas mikoy chalil odima, dam Hashem kodem negas mikoy nemechaper. a dilemma was raised before the sages. If there is blood of a burnt offering and blood of a guilt offering to be sprinkled on the altar, which of them precedes the other? Does the blood of the burnt offering take place as it comes from an offering that is burned in its entirety on the altar, or perhaps the blood of a guilt offering takes precedence as it affects atonement? The Gemara suggests coming here, as the Mishnah teaches, that the blood of the sin offering precedes the blood of the burnt offering. One can infer from here that the blood of a guilt offering does not precede the blood of a burnt offering. Bidin hu di ba'elemes dam asham v'ai di ba'elemes tasefa evare oilekoy milimachados. The Gemara rejects this proof. By right, the Mishnah should have taught this halacha with regard to the blood of a guilt offering. One could then have inferred that the blood of a sin offering, which takes precedence over the blood of a guilt offering, also precedes blood of a burnt offering. But since the Mishnah wants to teach the latter clause, the burning of the limbs of a burnt offering precedes the portions of a sin offering, it also mentions a sin offering in the former clause. The Gemara explains why the latter clause had to mention a sin offering rather than a guilt offering. As had the Mishnah taught this principle of the latter clause with regard to the portions of a guilt offering, I would say that it is only the portions of a guilt offering over which the limbs of a burnt offering take precedence. But they do not take precedence over the portions of a sin offering as a sin offering. It is of greater sanctity than a guilt offering. Due to this reason, the Mishnah in the former clause also taught this principle with regard to a sin offering, and one cannot infer from this that its halacha does not apply to the guilt offering. Tashima chatas pedim la'asham chatas udikad b'lei la'asham avaloi lala my love dam. The Gemara suggests coming here, as the Mishnah states that a sin offering precedes a guilt offering, one can infer from this that it is only a sin offering that precedes a guilt offering, but a burnt offering does not. What is the Mishnah not referring to the sprinkling of the blood, which would indicate that the blood of a burnt offering does not precede the blood of a guilt offering? Lo. The Gemara rejects this explanation. No, it is referring to the precedence of the sacrificial portions consumed on the altar. The Gemara adds that the language of the Mishnah is also precise in this regard, as it teaches that the sin offering takes precedence due to the fact that its blood is placed on the four corners of the altar, rather than simply teaching it is placed on the four corners of the altar, as it would have taught had it been speaking of the blood. One can therefore conclude from the statement of the Mishnah that its subject is the sacrificial portions burned on the altar, not the blood. The Mishnah teaches a sin offering precedes a guilt offering due to the fact that its blood is placed on the four corners of the altar, and the remainder of its blood is poured on the base of the altar. The Gemara challenges, on the contrary, the guilt offering should precede the sin offering, as it has a fixed minimal value of 2 shekels, as stated in the Torah, Leviticus 5:15, whereas the sin offering has no minimal value. The Gemara explains, even so, the fact that the sin offering requires more placements of the blood on the altar is of greater importance. Ashem kodim l'soida kuli adirabe hatoy divar nozir kadmi shekein tunin lechem afilu hachi kadshi kadashim adipi. The Mishnah further teaches a guilt offering precedes a thanks offering, and the Nazarite's ram, due to the fact that it is an offering of the most sacred order. The Gemara challenges, on the contrary, the thanks offering and the Nazarite's ram should precede the guilt offering, as they require loaves to be brought with them. The Gemara explains, even so, the fact that the guilt offering is an offering of the most sacred order is of greater importance. Toy Devar Nazir. Toy Devar Nazir. Where are we holding here? It's a long daf. Toy Devar Nazir. Kule Adarabba. Shlamim Kad Mi Shekin Yesh. Numetziv Kaviyachim. The Mishnah teaches a thanks offering and the Nazarite's ram precede a peace offering due to the fact that they are eaten for only one day. The Gemara challenges, on the contrary, peace offerings should precede the thanks offering and the Nazarite's ram, as they are offered by the community as well as by the individual. A communal peace offering is sacrificed on the festival of Shavuot, but there is no communal thanks offering or Nazarite's ram. The Gemara explains, even so, the fact that the thanks offering and the Nazarite's ram are eaten for only one day is of greater importance. If שזו תאונה 4 מיני לחם וזו אינו תאונה אלא 2 מיני לחם. A dilemma was raised before the sages. If there is a thanks offering and a Nazarite's ram to be sacrificed, which of them precedes the other? Does the thanks offering take precedence, as it requires 4 types of loaves, whereas the Nazarite's ram requires only 2? Or perhaps the Nazarite's ram takes precedence, as there are offerings whose blood is placed on the altar together with the Nazarite's ram. A Nazarite is required to sacrifice a burnt offering and a sin offering as well as ram. The Gemara answers, come in here a Braita that explicitly discusses this case. This offering precedes that offering, as this offering, meaning the thanks offering, requires 4 types of loaves, and that offering, the Nazarite's ram, requires only 2 types of loaves. Adarabba, before Kodim, Shekin Kiddush Samer Rechem Menechem Kohanim, Afilu Hachim Mitzvah Sisero Isadipi. The Mishnah teaches, and the peace offering precedes the firstborn offering due to the fact that the peace offering requires 2 placements of the blood on the altar that are 4, and the placement of hands on the animal's head, and libations, and the wavings of the breast and thigh. The Gemara challenges, on the contrary, the sacrifice of the firstborn offering should precede the peace offering, as it is sanctified from the womb and it is eaten only by the priests, whereas the peace offering may be eaten by non-priests. The Gemara explains, even so, the fact that additional mitzvot are performed in the case of the peace offering is of greater importance. מעשר קודם שכן מקדש לפניו ולאחריו אפילו הכי קידוש שומר רחם עדיפו. The Mishnah further teaches the firstborn offering precedes the animal tithe offering because it is sanctified from the womb and is eaten only by the priests. The Gemara challenges, on the contrary, the animal tithe offering should precede the firstborn offering, as if one mistakenly called the 9th or 11th animal that emerged from the pen the 10th, those animals that came out before or after the 10th are also sanctified. The Gemara explains, even so, the fact that the firstborn is sanctified from the womb is of greater importance. The Mishnah teaches the animal tithe offering precedes bird offerings due to the fact that it requires slaughtering, whereas the bird's nape is pinched. And furthermore, there are 2 elements of the animal tithe offering that have the status of offerings of the most sacred order: its blood, which is presented on the altar, and its portions that are burned on the altar. The Gemara challenges, on the contrary, bird offerings should precede the animal tithe offering, as they are offerings of the most sacred order, whether they are burnt offerings or sin offerings. The Gemara explains, even so, the fact that the animal tithe is a type of offering that requires slaughtering is of greater importance. Amar Ravina bar Shela in Morim Chadshim Kalim Shiatzu Lifnei Zrikas Damim Psulin Usnatuna Mipnei Shehu Zevach V'Yeshnu Chadshim Damav Morim. Rava bar Shela says, with regard to the sacrificial portions that are consumed on the altar, sacrificial portions of offerings of lesser sanctity that left the temple courtyard before the sprinkling of the blood are disqualified. And the Tana of the Mishnah also taught the animal tithe offering precedes bird offerings due to the fact that it requires slaughtering, and there are two elements of the animal tithe offering that have the status of offerings of the most sacred order. Its blood and its sacrificial portions consumed on the altar. The Gemara explains how Ravina bar Shela interprets the Mishnah in support of his opinion. Granted, there are no sacrificial portions consumed on the altar from a bird offering, but its blood at least is sprinkled. Why then does the Mishnah mention the blood? Rather, is it not mentioned in order to teach us that the status of the sacrificial portions consumed on the altar from the animal tithe offering and other offerings of lesser sanctity is comparable to the status of his blood? The Gemara explains the implications of this comparison, just as its blood referred to the Mishnah. Is blood before its sprinkling on the altar, and afterward is no longer any sanctity. So too, the sacrificial portions mentioned in the Mishnah are from before the sprinkling of the blood, and the Mishnah calls them at this stage offerings of the most sacred order, and therefore one can infer from this that just as the animal tithe blood is disqualified by leaving the temple courtyard, so too the sacrificial portions to be burned on the altar are disqualified by leaving the courtyard. The Gemara attempts to prove the opinion of Ravina bar Shela. Let us say that the following dispute between Amoraim supports his statement. With regard to flesh of offerings of lesser sanctity that left the temple courtyard before the sprinkling of the blood, Rabbi Yochanan says that it is fit, and Rish Lakish says that it is disqualified. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kasher, Rish Lakish Amar Pasul. Adayin lo higia zman says ad kan lo pligi ela bebasa aval b'mimunin lo. The Gemara clarifies this dispute. Rabbi Yochanan says that it is fit, since it will ultimately leave the temple courtyard, as offerings of lesser sanctity may be eaten anywhere within the walls of Jerusalem. Rish Lakish says that it is unfit, as its time to leave the temple courtyard has not yet arrived, because the flesh cannot be taken out until after the sprinkling of the blood. The Gemara infers that these Amoraim disagree only with regard to the flesh of the offering, which will eventually leave the temple courtyard, but with regard to the sacrificial portions of the offering, which will never leave the courtyard, they do not disagree, as Rabbi Yochanan concedes that those portions are disqualified. Hu hadin be'emorin nami pligi v'hadikam mipalgi b'baso v'diacha kocho deresh lakish te'afilu basal desofa letzes amal adayin lo higia zmano letzet. The Gemara rejects this proof. The same is true with regard to the sacrificial portions, meaning these Amoraim also disagree. In that case, as Rabbi Yochanan holds, they are fit. And the reason that they disagree explicitly with regard to the flesh is to convey to you the far-reaching nature of the opinion of Reish Lakish, as even with regard to the flesh, which will ultimately leave the temple courtyard, he says that it is disqualified because its time to leave the courtyard has not yet arrived. Shiatzef Nezires Damim, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ein Marim Bahem. The Gemara suggests, let us say that this dispute between Amoraim is parallel to a dispute between Tanaim with regard to the sacrificial portions of offerings of lesser sanctity that left the temple courtyard before the sprinkling of the blood. Rabbi Eliezer says that one who benefits from them is not liable for the misuse of consecrated property.